Hello, and welcome to the Pit Pony Podcast with myself, Sharon Corley,
and me, Sarah Dunwood,
in which we talk to teachers from all walks of life who exited the classroom from what they thought was a job for life and thrived on the other side of teaching. Coming up in this episode,
the way you're speaking to people, me in this case now, is totally unprofessional. It's totally unacceptable. I'm out. See you later. You can deal with it. You can speak to whoever you want. I'm gone. I wish there'd been a little bit more forthright and, for want of a better term, in the conversation, aggressive, because I think that would have created a bit of shock. Because instead what I did was remove myself professionally. That's the last time I spoke to that human being face to face.
Hello listeners, and welcome to a wonderful episode of the Pit Pony Podcast. We've got Paul Lennon with us today, and Paul actually started teaching at about the same time I did. We worked out that there's probably a year apart between us, and he served 28 years in secondary schools. Started off originally as a PE teacher, rose to head of department, assistant principal, held a whole host of roles throughout his career. Started potentially as a professional footballer, and he used a PE teacher role as a backup. As a bookworm, self-confessed, his second subject was literature. So when he'd finished university, he travelled to Japan. But when he came back from Japan, he did 3 years in a school in Peckham, which he loved. But the rest and the majority of his career was spent overseas. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating to listen to. But it was in his last school that Paul experienced bullying. And I listened to a lot of bullying within schools. But he experienced a type of bullying, a sandwich of toxicity between alpha male relationships, the likes of which I've never come across before. So, welcome, Paul. Thank you for sharing your story with us. And can you tell us what it is you're doing today?
Yeah, these days I work for the wonderful NHS, one of the foundations as part of the NHS, based with the South Central Ambulance Service. I take calls for the 111 service. I coach new call handlers as they come into that service. And I'm just about to embark on a middle management role there as a team leader within that whole context, taking emergency calls and managing that work with the National Health Service.
Wow. So before we get into all of that, can we have just a potted walkthrough of your career? Right up until, just to get a flavour of who you are, really, your family and the vision that you had for yourselves when you started out into teaching. And take us up to that last school when you left teaching in your 50s after your school in Warsaw. Right. Thanks, Paul. I'm really looking forward to hearing this.
Yes. So, we've spoken before, Sharon. I started off moving into the plan for education, doing a B.Ed at university in PE and English literature, as you've already said. And in the role of going through that, I realised that I wasn't yet quite ready on graduating to simply go into a school in the UK and take the normal job as most of my peers were doing at the time, and was determined to travel. And in my first year out after graduating, I was really lucky to be offered a job teaching English and coaching and playing football in rural southern Japan, of all places. And cutting that very long story short, it didn't work out. On paper, it was my dream job. I thought I'd literally landed on the pig's back, and that wasn't the case. And so within 2 weeks of being out there, I was back with my tail between my legs, back living in the town where I graduated, feeling sorry for myself, if the truth be told. And thanks to some really close friends and also the person who eventually became my wife, applied for some roles doing supply teaching. And on the back of a couple of terms of full supply in Luton, actually, I ended up with a job, as you've mentioned in your introduction, in Southeast London in Peckham at a school called St Thomas the Apostle College, which was one of the most amazing experiences I've had in a long life of travel and education. After about 3 years of that, the urge to travel was still there, and I'd been saving up. So went off backpacking, as many people did back in the 90s. Did a bit of supply teaching in Australia as part of that in a school called Salesian College in Melbourne. And then on return, the person who is now my wife and I kind of said, hold on a minute, how do we work overseas but not travel, because we now need to be mature adults. We were engaged. We were thinking about having a family. And so we ended up applying for international teaching jobs, which in those days were advertised on the back of the Times Educational Supplement, the back couple of pages. We applied for 2 jobs in Turkey, which fitted because they had PE jobs for 2 of us, and one in Milan, and there was PE jobs for 2 of us. And the one in Milan came off. We didn't really know what we were doing, but we accepted, and off we went and worked at the International School of Milan for 4 years. And from there, the career progressed. We would have been there forever, but we still had itchy feet. And so when we had our first child, I applied for some more international jobs, ended up in Oxford in an international school called St. Clair's in Oxford, England. We had our second child, so then we're both ready to apply for new jobs, and ended up going to a school in Malawi in Southeast Africa, and we were there for 6 years. Amazing times, and after those 6 years, again, we were kind of a little bit itchy feet again, and contrary to what all the advice was, we went to Moscow, Russia, and worked in the Anglo-American School of Moscow for 6 years before all the chaos of today. Pretty topical based on the last day or 2 of news, but being in Russia for 6 years prior to all of that was incredible. 6 wonderful years there. And again, we got itchy feet and we moved to another international school in West Africa, in Senegal. So back to the continent of Africa, in a totally different part of that continent. And we did 4 years at the International School of Dakar. And at that point, my wife made the decision to step out of education. So we were ready to have another change, but, she wasn't going to do teaching. So I applied for new positions again and ended up in Warsaw at the American School of Warsaw in Poland. And yeah, that's where things changed, let's say.
Okay, well, before we do that last school, you cannot globetrot like you've just done without Sarah going, wow, what do you think, Sarah, is for that as a CV?
I think that's an episode where I think I would love the video, because my face said everything. It was like, where haven't you been? Have you been to every continent?
We haven't been to South America, and I feel quite settled at the moment, and so does my wife. But when you ask that question, I'm like, yeah, we need to get to South America.
Please apologize to your wife. I'm so sorry. I'm stepping away now.
So South America is one continent we've not been to yet.
Paul, would it be fair to say that your experience, really, really broad experience in different countries, different schools, different positions, up until this last school, was it happy? Were you happy with what? Obviously, nobody's 100% happy, but in the main, had you enjoyed a good and rich career as a teacher?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, you preempted what I was just going to say. Of course, we all know life is a roller coaster. So happiness is, it depends on what's going on at any given time. But in terms of contentment, fulfillment, being challenged, being positive in the career, yeah, without a doubt. And we were able to, meld our passion for travel with our passion for education. And, we talk about travel and education, and we talk about travel as education. And without a doubt, that was our experience for the vast majority of that journey.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. And I can only begin to imagine the memories that you have. But let's go to this school. This is your last school, and we'll find out why it was the last school. specifically and in as much detail as you feel comfortable, talk about your role in Warsaw.
Yeah, so there may be listeners who are familiar with international curriculum, and I'm sure there's listeners who are not familiar with international curriculum. I was working as part of schools that were taking on the International Baccalaureate Organisation's curricula, from the primary years programme through the middle years programme, and their equivalent of A-levels or Scottish Highers or Irish Leaving Cert is known as the International Baccalaureate Diploma Programme. And so my role moving into Warsaw was as the Diploma Programme Coordinator. So in simple terms, it's similar to a head of sixth form in England. It's about managing students in the final 2 years of high school and everything from pastoral issues to, the organisation and the administration of examinations, etc. So I was the IB Diploma Coordinator in Poland, which was a sideways step. I'd been assistant principal and IB Diploma Coordinator in the previous school in Dakar, but was really excited to come back to Europe. My youngest son at the time had 2 years left, and he was very keen to return to Europe and city life, which he's a big advocate for, as is my wife. And so it felt like a really good move. And so that was the role in that particular school.
Where did it start to go wrong? Where did it not start to feel the way you had felt in other schools?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there was a couple of things that appeared really, really quickly. The first one was something that we can all empathize with, I think, and that was COVID. The world was different in different places around COVID, but we all had the experience of a global pandemic. So the first point I understood where certain things were different or potentially problematic was in regards to how that school had experienced COVID in Central Eastern Europe in relation to experiences that I'd had or other colleagues around different parts of the world had had. And it became quite clear quite quickly that the school had taken a different pathway compared to the rest of Poland and the rest of the educational institutions in Poland, because it had that slightly different status in regards to being an international school, somewhat under the umbrella of the American Embassy in Poland. And so at some points in COVID before I got there, it was the only school in the whole country that was open. And as we all know, there was lots of anxiety around all sorts of things in terms of COVID. So arriving into that school when COVID was still a thing and we still had lots of testing in the school and, lots of protocols in place, it became quite clear that the school had experienced quite a lot of trauma around that because it was so different to what the rest of the country had to go through or chosen to go through. And so that was the first thing. And then the other thing that became apparent quite quickly, and I think you alluded to it in the introduction, was I became quite clear quite quickly that there was quite a toxicity in the school, and it related to a real clash between the overall leadership from director to the high school leadership. And I didn't really know the ins and outs of that really until things got bad for me. But ultimately, the director of the school and the high school principal clashed in a really alpha way. And there was very much a kind of, you're on his side, you're on his side. For my sins, I had actually worked under the director in Moscow. So without even knowing it, when I came into a leadership position in high school, I was deemed to be one of his guys. And that was the start of kind of trying to negotiate, doing a professional job, building team, being part of a leadership team, and then suddenly realizing that there was all this deep toxicity, deep mistrust, and sort of two sides, if you like, within the school. And I don't know if I mentioned this to you before, Sharon, when we spoke, but I remember really clearly there was a really super professional who worked down in elementary who happened to be a friend of a friend. And I went down there one day just in my first couple of weeks to say, look, I'm really open to collaboration, and some of the work I do relates directly with some of the work that takes place in primary school and elementary school. Really love to collaborate at some point once I get my feet under the table. And this person who's a super professional, who I didn't know, just a friend of a friend, looked at me and she said, good luck of that. I stay on my ship down here in elementary because I've tried that and that ship is sinking. And I can remember thinking at the time, that's a really strange thing for somebody who I can see as a highly competent professional to somebody who's new, trying to kind of build bridges and say, hey, look, let's try and do some collaboration. So there was some red flags pretty quickly, pretty early.
And obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, now you can look back on that comment. What did she mean? What was going on in that school where the word collaboration was just scoffed at? What was actually happening within the infrastructure of that school? Because I think that is the root and the root cause to why you left. What did it look like and feel like when you were in that building?
Yeah, I think the first thing that springs to mind is lack of trust. You guys, as ex-educators, current educators, will probably have the term suitcase curriculum. And it became really quickly that people were just getting on with their job behind the doors and did not want to put their head up over the parapet for any reason. So again, to give you an anecdote, I can remember organising a meeting that would happen once monthly that the person in my role would lead. And I said to the team in the office, an amazing group of Polish ladies, would it be okay to order some croissants and some coffee for this morning meeting that's now going to take place once a month? And they organised that with the catering staff. And, that was just at the start of the meeting. I said to the teachers coming in, basically the equivalent of A-level teachers, we've got a meeting to go today. Really appreciate you taking the time coming before school. A few croissants and some coffee and some juice. We'll have 10 minutes to socialise before we begin the meeting. And honestly, you would have thought that I'd bought each of them a diamond ring. There was utter celebration and this is wonderful. This is amazing. So, that was it. That's a positive story, but it made me realize straight away, oh, goodness me, there isn't this feeling of team. People are just keeping their heads down, doing what they're doing. Inevitably, as is the case, I think in every school, there are highly competent professionals who just want to get on with their stuff because they don't want to have to deal with whatever toxicity appears. So that was, again, another red flag. And it just felt really difficult to have open and honest conversations because there was such a lack of trust. And I guess if you and I and Sarah, now Sharon, just spoke about, what our views might be around how we conduct meetings, we would be able to have a back and forth and an open and we go, okay, if we're going to be having meetings every 3 weeks, here's how we'll do it. And we find agreement and move on. And that was almost impossible right from the start.
How is that? How is it impossible? Were you met with resistance? Were you gaslit into thinking you were asking for something weird? How does a block like that actually take place?
Yeah, really quickly. But all of those things. So in leadership meetings with the high school principal, the assistant principal, myself, and counsellors, which is how it was structured in that particular school. Really quickly, there was deep resistance to any thoughts or suggestions about, what might we do in this situation, or, this is what's been going on in this school for a couple of years. I'm coming in, I've got UIs, don't want to push an agenda too hard, but what do we think about X or Y? And it was immediately met with, particularly from the high school principal, quite aggressive language and how do I say, being put down in meetings in a very unprofessional way, or, almost aggressively. That kind of alpha, suddenly I'm going to shout because I'm in control and you're not going to be able to have your voice. And it was apparent to me quite quickly that the counsellors, particularly in that meeting, that leadership meeting, which happened once a week, one of them had a really loud voice, which was respected, and the other one said nothing, despite probably having the most experience in the room. So there was all of that kind of, to use your phrase, gaslighting, intimidation, but it was really subtle. So what I found myself doing really regularly was going home and going, is this me? Am I the new guy trying to push an agenda? Or in your heart, you've got 25 years experience. In your heart, you want collaboration. In your heart, you've got the students right at the center of the thinking. But in your head, you're going, Is it me? What's going on?
And because it doesn't just happen once with absolute clarity and the penny drops, it might have potentially happened 3 times before you'd not clocked on. And then it just starts with an odd wobble, and it comes that self-doubt. You're almost like the boy in the emperor's new clothes. Everybody else around seems to be thinking, "This is okay." You've talked about a form of aggression in the room and being spoken to, and we'll come on to how you were spoken to ultimately. But you're right, if you are not in a safe space within a leadership position, and normally the people who are trying to pigeonhole you and stop you collaborating, they're normally coming from a position of fear because they are the biggest imposters in the room. And anybody who's presenting themselves with experience and ideas are hugely feared by those. But you're in a meeting, you're coming up with, well, what you know to be or believe to be good ideas, improvements. Did you actually achieve anything? In your time there, did you get anything passed? Did you change anything? Or were you blocked at every single turn?
No, I wasn't blocked at every single turn, and I think it's such a good question again, because I think it's really important for us to maintain, a rationale that it wasn't all bad. One of the most positive things that happened was I nudged really hard in what we all might describe as our honeymoon period in a new role, and to develop a group that was a middle leadership team for the specific area of curriculum that my role led. And that team included 4 people. And it was amazing that we got those 4 people on the team. It could have been a different 4 people. I could give you a whole other podcast about that, as an amazing lady who should have been fundamental in a role like that. And unfortunately, she left the school because her husband faced similar toxic issues. It's a whole other story. But anyway, we did get a good team in place. And I think what was so apparent with that team for ultimately what was a short period of time, there was a trust built because of how I know how to lead, which allowed that autonomy in the context of collective leadership, flattened leadership, but with decision making being taken as required. And in terms of leading 2 or 3 parts of the curriculum for international baccalaureate diploma students, that team functioned pretty well. And I think all the people that were in it would agree that for a small amount of time, because once we got the team in place, that was something that the 4 of us were in charge of day to day, week to week. And there was trust. Trust was built. It took a while, but 2 or 3 people in that team said quite early on, we actually have a voice here, or you're not saying things just for the sake of it. Actually, when you're saying, tell me what you think, or your responsibility now is to take that idea and run with it, that's what's happening. So there was definitely some positives around work and leadership. And of course, always in schools, the biggest positives always surround students and how students behave and interact, despite toxicity that might be going on behind closed doors with adults.
I don't want to preempt because I don't know what you and Sharon have talked about on the pre-record, but I'm getting a sense that you building teams that are functioning and functional is potentially a bugbear to leaders who are not happy about that. Am I preempting, or am I off on a...
No, sir, I think you're on the money. I'd be interested to hear what you both think, because my experience of highly functioning teams are often like this conversation now. The question you've just asked has been really careful, really considered. You trod carefully there because you weren't quite sure. You didn't have all the information. And guess what? You get a big answer from me. And in my experience of dysfunctional leadership, and I might be showing my own prejudice here, often there are highly egotistical men who refuse to even ask the sort of question that you've just done.
That's where I'm coming from, is I think when you talk about leadership and effective leadership, people listen for what's not being said. And I'd anticipated it, but didn't want to preempt it. And I think I'm kind of hearing, without you saying it, certain traits in that person who is the head teacher of the school, if that's the correct phrase, that kind of grandiosity, self-importance, the arrogance, interpersonal exploitation in terms of behavior, that some things are allowed and some things are not. And I've kind of read between the lines of a type of personality that would block, but would also not block, which then causes you to gaslight yourself. Well, okay, this is okay, so it must be me, when that situation isn't all right with them. And I think that causes a massive internal conflict when you're trying to lead from a place of, what am I looking for? When you're trying to lead ethically and in a supportive way for your team, but then you've got something sat around you that causes you to question why you're doing what you're doing and whether you're doing it right.
Yeah, 100%. I think that was endemic in that school. I spoke about the female leader down in elementary, who really, I maintain this to this day, is a very, very highly competent professional, and that response is a symptom of that. I also worked with two people who are close friends from previous employment, epitomized that kind of, stepping out because they realized that certain things could and certain things couldn't. And I think, Sharon mentioned earlier on about the toxic sandwich. It really wasn't just the high school principal for whom a lot of that was what I experienced day to day. It was the assistant principal who'd come in, if you like, to be simplistic in that, had been appointed to all intents and purposes by the high school principal, and I'd been appointed to all intents and purposes by the director. So there was all that all that nonsense. There was the dysfunctional relationship between the director and the high school principal, and all of these relationships, in terms of a dysfunction, were all male leaders that are in their positions for their ego above what we're actually doing, which is helping young people be ready for the next steps in life, whether it's, from elementary school to middle school, or whether it's from school to university, or whether it's from school to a gap year. This big problem of ego, when, we're not running governments or, multinational companies, we're helping young people just get a wee bit better every day,
Wow. And the behavior in and of itself is, if I'm right in thinking, you'd sort of wedged yourself in a bit, hadn't you, family-wise, because you'd got 2 years to do with your boy. So your son came into play here.
Yes.
So to a certain extent, you were trapped. Not that I'm putting that on your kid kind of thing, but you'd made a decision for your child's education. You had to do 2 years in this school. And from somebody who'd been quite free-spirited, let's move here. I don't want to be trapped. We can do whatever we want, love. We can go wherever we want to go. In that particular school, you had to stay for a certain amount of time. Do you think that impacted on your mental health?
Yeah, I really think it did, Sharon. And obviously now I'm speaking with the benefit of hindsight. My youngest son was really excited to move to Warsaw. And then, of course, once you move and you're starting your last 2 years of high school, as we all know, that's the toughest time for any kid to change school. And it went really well for my youngest lad. He was lucky. He's a decent sportsman. The first sports season in that school was the football season. He's a good player. He got his mates really quickly, and that really helped. And he loved being in a fairly medium-sized European city with lots of freedom in terms of public transport and all that kind of thing. So he absolutely thrived. There's no doubt about that. And at the same time, because my wife and I decided that she was happy to step out of teaching. She was volunteering for that time. I was the sole breadwinner, and we knew that, Owen had to finish school in those 2 years. It's like A levels, and he was looking to go to university. So yeah, with the benefit of hindsight, some of these bad things that were happening, I think if they'd happened 20 years ago, I would have just gone on the next bus and got a job somewhere else, right? But suddenly you can't, because your child has got to finish school. You won't mind me saying, he needed a bit of some would say a gentle nudge, some would say a kick up the backside to do the studying that he needed to do. He did really well, and he's now happily ensconced at university in The Hague. But yeah, I think with the benefit of hindsight, it was a massive pressure, because ironically, the day that I had what we can all describe now in terms of, what the medical profession says, is that when I had a panic attack that prevented me from going to school, it was actually, ironically, the day that my wife was driving my son off to university in The Hague in Holland. That was the day where I couldn't go to school. I got halfway, I got off my bike and did the old kind of PE teacher thing of, you'll be all right, take a deep breath, you can speak to HR, you've got to have this meeting, it's not very nice, but you've dealt with difficult things before. Talked myself through it, got myself back on my bike, and it was about 200 meters from school, and the inner voice was, what are you doing? What are you doing? You need to get off your bike, you need to turn around, you need to go and call a doctor, and you need to then call the HR department at the school. And I'm lucky to say I did. That's what I did.
Brief interlude, dear listener. Couple of questions. Are you a tutor or even a pit pony considering tutoring? And do you fancy getting in the room with myself and Sarah Dunwood, learning about the wonderful world of tuition? Then why not join us at the National Tutors Conference, hosted by Connexus Tuition, on the 29th of July 2025. It's at Chesford Grange, Kenilworth. Links to the tickets are in the show notes below, and we will both see you on the other side. But just before that, there's just a slight prelude to what brought on that panic attack.
Mm-hmm.
You had got into the groove with somebody in that school where they were speaking to you in a way where you refer to it as they had lost their mind when they were speaking to you. They were insanely angry with you.
Yes.
Okay. So you'd been having interactions, you'd gone in for meetings, because 10 days, even 10 days before a new term, you'd been in a room with somebody who, I hope I'm not over-egging the pudding, had lost his mind and was shouting at you, who he works with. Talk us through that kind of interaction with somebody in the workplace who is, to use your words, insanely angry.
Yeah, no, that's fair. So a few days before that, we were back at the school, before students come back, getting ready for the new year, etc., etc. And one of the things I had to do is have one of those meetings again with the croissants and the coffee with the faculty that deliver the curriculum to the final 2 years of school. And that particular meeting prior to students coming back was about the previous year's results and so on and so forth. And in that meeting, I was pretty I've got some skills, and I was pretty confident and competent about negotiating some difficult discussions with the faculty about where results were, where they weren't, how COVID might have impacted, how it might not, what parents might say, etc. And at the end of that meeting, which in my perception had gone, as would be expected with colleagues, and there were some questions and there were some concerns and there were some positives, I sort of made a light comment to say, and the bottom line is, every year is different. So we know we have to look at the facts and figures and the statistics, but ultimately averages are what they say. They're averages. And I made quite a light comment at the very end of the meeting and said, because on average, most amputees have only got less than 2 legs. Point being, we have to take statistics, carefully with a pinch of salt sometimes and otherwise not. And that's the first time in that particular academic year that the high school principal got extremely angry and started shouting and saying, parents have been talking to me, and of course the results matter because this is what I have to face every day, and you guys don't understand it because I have to cover for you all. And that was in front of everybody, and of course directed at what I just led. So I felt pretty insecure and shaky about that. But because in that particular meeting, there's a level of confidence and competence on my part, it didn't bother me too much. But that was at the start of the new year. We'd had a really good whole school leadership kind of retreat 2 or 3 days before that, and I was feeling ready for the new year. That happened, and I came home and I was saying to my wife, oh, this is another one of those moments where I'm questioning things. Moved forwards. And then 2 or 3 days after that, the high school principal called me into his office with a question around where we, it sounds really trivial now, and please tell me if I'm going off the point, but where we would calendar the mock exams that year. And mock exams come very similar to A-levels, this time of year, basically. And I said what I'd thought and what I'd planned. You always have to do it around different holidays because holidays fall different in international schools for all sorts of reasons around religious beliefs, country holidays, etc. And again, he got very, very shouty just in a meeting, just with me and him, in regards to the fact that I wasn't listening to teachers and I never took on board anything, and this is what had to happen, and et cetera, et cetera. And I simply said, look, I'm happy to compromise in any way. We can make the exams work in whatever days we need the mock exams. What I do have to say professionally and in the interest of the students is if we do them here, there'll be less time for valuable feedback from teachers to students before the real exams. That was my only professional point at that stage. I've just got to highlight a professional concern about that short gap. And he did, I'll quote you, Sharon, he lost his mind and he started shouting. And I wish now, with the benefit of hindsight, I had been a little bit more forthright. At the time, I thought, I'm going to stay professional. I'm going to take a deep breath and I'm going to say, with all due respect, we can't conduct meetings like this. If you continue to speak with me like this, I'm going to remove myself from the meeting, which is what happened. Bear in mind, there was one door and then there was the office management staff outside that door. They could all hear. That's what I did. I removed myself from the meeting in that way. With the benefit of hindsight, I wished I'd said, you can't speak to people like this. The way you're speaking to people, me in this case now, is totally unprofessional. It's totally unacceptable. I'm out. See you later. You can deal with it. You can speak to whoever you want. I'm gone. I wish there'd been a little bit more forthright and, for want of a better term in the conversation, aggressive, because I think that would have created a bit of shock. Because instead, what I did was remove myself professionally. That's the last time I spoke to that human being face to face. I went and reported that incident to my upper line manager, the assistant director of the school. And that person said, take a breath, go and have a cup of coffee. Do you need anything? And then I actually went back to my office and carried on my day's work because both of us assumed that the high school principal at some point would come and say, look, sorry, that meeting didn't go well. Let's reconvene. Never saw him again. I ended my day, having done my day's work. And it was the next day that the panic attack happened on the way to work. I've never spoken to that person since. I'm sad to say. I'm really sad to say.
I told you this was an unusual one, Sarah, because it is very, in my experience, it might not be very rare for our listeners, but to actually hear of a line manager or anyone within a school raising their voice, shouting, losing their temper with people. I speak to loads of people, Paul, who are being bullied, but it's not in that way. It's not in that aggressive, violent way of doing. There's absolutely no point in trying to relive what you should and shouldn't have done. You were in massive shock because you get to a certain age where people don't speak to people like that. We don't live in a world where somebody's shouting in your face. So you will have frozen, not you. I think you handled yourself really, really well. But that is unusual behaviour. What do you think, Sarah? It's not something we...
No, and I'm writing lots of things down, and I think we'll probably talk about it in the epilogue, because I suspect, Sharon, you know where I'm going with this. That principal is exhibited to you some very specific traits that suggest a specific personality disorder. And I wrote down what you said, that they said that you don't listen, that you don't come to the middle ground, you don't do this. Well, actually, that was their description of their behavior. They weren't listening, they weren't compromising, they weren't doing. I think for me, there's a difference. Professionally, you can have crosswords with someone.
Mm-hmm.
It happens. It absolutely happens. But I think where you came to is absolutely right. You have crosswords with, and I'll tell you for nothing, Sharon and I have had crosswords at different times. And then an hour later, one will ring the other and go, I am so sorry. That was me. That was on me. My head's up my bum, or whatever it was. But there will be a coming back together, thrash it out, sorted. You articulated it. You were expecting them to come back and go, I am so sorry. I was out of order. And they didn't. And it wasn't the first time. As a result of that, it became the last time.
Yeah. And I think it's really important for me to say here that person experienced those sorts of conversations with the director. And for whatever reasons, nobody within that world called them both out and said, guys, what are you doing? You know? And that's really tough, because I think it became really apparent to me that people's heads were in the sand. And I'll give you one more anecdote, if I may, and it's nothing to do with me, it's to do with young people. A lot of us were involved in coaching sports teams there. And as I said, my wife had stepped out of teaching, but due to an absolutely brilliant athletics director, head of sport at that school, she was persuaded to come in 3 times a week in the winter term to coach sport. She's also an ex-PE teacher. And at the start of that season, all the kids are in there. They're all really excited. And the sports director, or athletics director, as it's called in American international schools, sort of introduce all the new coaches and get everybody up for the new season. And so my wife was there, you know, she didn't know the school. She'd heard a couple of stories. This is early in my time. I'd heard a couple of stories about some of the dysfunction. And at the end of the little introduction that evening, the high school principal came in to just sort of get the students up. And then we were all going out to the fields. I was coaching football at the time. My wife was coaching volleyball. Everyone was going to go off and do their first coaching session. And he lost his mind again, because one football player, 18-year-old lad, probably been doing A-level biology or the equivalent, strolled in a wee bit late, sat down at the back, on the floor, by the way, it's in a gym floor, said hello to his mate, and this principal started screaming about where was everybody's commitment and what was going on. I don't need to articulate the length of that angry exchange. But my wife had never been in the school environment, heard a few anecdotes from me. And when that finished, myself and the guy I was going to be coaching football with just walked over to Kate. He knew her. And she just said, oh my God. She, again, very experienced professional with many years, just in that school environment, just for that evening. That was her phrase. And she said, how can this person be anywhere near young people? She had no background at all. And me and the other football coach, he wasn't in the school every day. He was an outside coach. We sort of just laughed and we sort of said, welcome to our world. But that was just about young people going out to do volleyball practice or football practice, you know? So I think you're right, Sarah. That again points to these alpha males with what you would term as, personality disorders or dysfunctions or their own mental health issues that are not addressed.
Were there loads of complaints about him? Was he constantly being pulled up in front of the equivalent of the governors? Were parents kicking off?
Well, I think what happened was, again, because I mean, this is really deep toxic culture. There was this huge sort of, to be crude, cockfight between the director and the high school principal. And so people tended to side or keep their heads down and get on with their job quietly. Because ultimately, and I want to make this clear, a lot of very good professionals in that institution doing really good work for young people, which is always the case, right? But there was complaints on both sides about director, about high school principal, about assistant principals' involvement in this or that. It was just a real mess, and I guess I still haven't unpicked half of it, because it became really clear to me once my son left school and all the things that happened to me. I was just like, I'm out. And I had hope that might be mediation and, reconciliation. And I lost faith in that pretty quickly as well. So ultimately handed in my resignation, because I was like, I'm not prepared at my age to go through a process that I don't have any trust in.
Wow. It does beg a belief that that kind of behaviour is going on anywhere, but let alone within a school. It's crackers. I don't know if it's because it's abroad. I don't know if it's because people didn't want to rock the boat because they'd found themselves in this position. They're at the other side of the world. Parents are frightened that the kids will lose places at the school, because you never put your head above the parapet if somebody's got something over you that you need, really, whether it's your job or your kid's position. But I don't think that would happen in the UK. I could be wrong, Sarah, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. I've been in situations in schools where, for exactly what you've just articulated, that even though you know that something's going on, and even though there's a body of you as adults who know that something's not right, you don't want to whistle blow. You don't want to stick your head above it, because actually what happens if that backfires? And but you do see it over here with parents. Parents gather together, and I've seen head teachers ousted and things like that, but I don't know. I genuinely don't know.
I told you it was an unusual one. I told you it was bullying, but not typical of the bullying behaviour that we have. But what I think is also interesting is, I've got this picture of you practically at the school gate on your bike, knowing that something is very, very wrong. And in a short period of time, I don't know you at all, Paul, we've got great mutual friends, but I suspect you'd had periods in your life where your mental health wasn't as robust as it could have been, and because we all do life's life. But you're there at the age of 50 odd on a bike having a panic attack because of the way you're being spoken to in a state of abject trauma. How did that impact you? You get out, you go. Did that lead to the need for therapy at that point?
Yeah, it did. I think I spoke a few minutes ago about, the inner voice was saying, what are you doing? You need to call a doctor. I knew that somewhere deep inside myself, and call HR. The HR department at the school were outstanding. And so I called the doctor and told HR, and they said, yeah, whatever you need. And I got a doctor's appointment that day, actually, as it turned out. And, because luckily in those sorts of schools, we're all on, because you're overseas, you're all on, overseas private healthcare, et cetera. And I went to see the doctor, and I really was in a bit of a state by then, because it was kind of that release of, okay, I haven't gone in. Okay, I've got a doctor's appointment and I'm now with the doctor. And she sort of did what doctors do and said, yeah, you're definitely in trauma. You're definitely having physical manifestations of what we describe as, high anxiety, panic attack. And she said, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to sign you off work for 2 weeks. And in that 2 weeks, I'll put you in touch with a range of options for therapy. And she said sometimes when people get in touch with the first person, it's not quite right. Feel free, if that's not right, to get in touch with us again. But this first person, I think, might be the one, but don't feel guilty at all if it's not. And I, in my state, I laugh now, but I was going, but that's not enough. I had my heads in my hand, like, that's not enough. And she said, well, what is enough then? And I said, I need time. And she said, that's what we're buying here. You've got 2 weeks off. You'll see a therapist. If it's not the right therapist, we'll get another one. And then that therapist will determine from their professional expertise what you need. And so I ended up being signed off for 6 months. And then the way the world went, I ended up not, my notice was handed in at the end of that time. But the therapist was amazing, absolutely amazing. And, I think men sometimes are, again, a little bit more reticent to engage in that kind of thing. Quite early in that process, the therapist said to me, I think you're probably okay. You don't need me anymore, but I'm quite happy to engage if you're happy to engage. And so I continued to engage as long as I was in Poland. And it was amazing. It was an amazing learning experience. And of course, I needed it in the first instance, and it really helped. And it helped clarify all sorts of things, not just around that tough 2 years, but, things over time that had perhaps built up,
Wow. I'm glad it worked itself through to that. Did anything happen within the school, or do people just leave, smoothed over, leave, smoothed over? Was there any big changes that you heard of afterwards where people had changed their ways, or there was a detoxification of the culture? Or did you just shut the door on it and go, I don't want to know anything about that place?
No, there's some people I deeply care about, apart from anything else, some really close friends and my son, but there's also colleagues there that I care about. And all sorts of things have happened, really, some by default, some by the fact that I quote my therapist, I had been a whistleblower. And I remember the therapist saying to me, being a whistleblower, whether intentional or not, is a lonely job. Because, of course, people want to, protect their livelihoods and their families, etc., and so on, especially in a dysfunctional society or a dysfunctional community. So the director has reached retirement age, which is a blessing in disguise. And I heard recently that the high school principal has been released from duty. And as often is the case in those sorts of situations, then the wagons are in a circle. I don't necessarily need to know the details, but at the same time, it's really interesting that even people that I love and care about there will say nothing. Now, I guess that's to do with non-disclosure agreements and all the rest of it, but I do know that that person has been released, and I think it's a blessing in disguise for him as well, because as you alluded to, Sarah, he's got some issues and some mental health concerns that need addressing, and I hope he does. Somebody said to me, a few months ago, how do you feel about the people that bullied you? And I said, regarding that particular person, I honestly, without being patronizing at all, feel pity and compassion. And for a couple of other people there, particularly the assistant principal, for the sake of being diplomatic on this podcast, I don't feel compassion or pity for that person, because they're one of these people that continue to leverage their ego and their narcissism for their own position. And so that person is not somebody I've got any care or pity or respect for. But for the high school principal himself, if I saw him, I'd say, how you doing? I hope you're getting the help you need, because I did and it helped me. I don't harbor any bitterness towards him, because I think it is an issue of mental health and maybe narcissism.
Wow, that's very, very benevolent of you. And I think that probably is a result of your therapy, is a result of the healing, because anger is toxic only to the vessel in which it is held, isn't it, at the end of the day? So in order to reach a position of forgiveness helps the healing. What are your thoughts, Sarah? Told you it was a firecracker of a story.
I've not actually written that many notes down because as has become customary now, I'm so kind of tied up in the story that it's so unusual because so much of what happens in schools in terms of our experience with group members is covert, it's subtle, it's that thing where we've said it to a few people that unless you write it all down and actually build up the big picture of all of the lots of little things, it feels like you're being an idiot. Whereas this was so overt, my brain can't quite process how overt it was.
If you think about it, I don't know if you've ever listened or our listeners have listened to this episode yet. We've got a great walkthrough by a guy called Johnny Millard. And Johnny Millard was an NQT, an early careers teacher. And he went through some of the most, I don't know, covert forms of bullying you will ever find in a school. So we're listening to you, Paul, who's been screamed at, shouted at. Johnny was brought to his knees by the way a book was put on a table and a chuckle. So let me just work that one through for you. He presented something to his head of history and the book was like slammed on the table. Oh, Johnny. and that's what was crippling Johnny. Eye rolling. People stopping talking when he went into a room. A change in tone and atmosphere on a corridor. He couldn't put his finger on it. He had a head teacher who'd say things like, Johnny, it's like juggling jelly with you. Wrapped up in what looks like compassion and humour and kindness. This was breaking this fella to the point he couldn't get out of bed. Like you, that's what we're used to. Where when people come to us and say, I've been bullied, but even when I've written it all down, how can I go with this? Because it's about how it makes you feel in the main. What you've got to do is you've got to go in and argue, well, it might have only been a chuckle. It might have only been the book going down. It might have been an eye roll. But put all this together and it's making me ill. You went through really violent bullying, being screamed at, shouted at. Nobody wants to be shouted at. You feel sick to your stomach and shaking when it's happened because we haven't lived in that, nor even raised our kids like that.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting, Sharon, is I think the covert stuff is really more powerful. So the way our chat has gone today, I'm talking about, some of the big overt things that happen. And I can really empathize with that colleague of yours because all of those covert things were happening, I now realize, all the way through. And, all of those things. Books on tables. I mean, that resonated because one of the first meetings I led, it was that kind of, this is being given to me as a new leader. I asked if I could provide 10 copies of a book called The Culture Code to a leadership team for a meeting I was leading. Culture Code by Coyle is the author, and it's just about enhancing positive culture in workplace. And I was granted the monies to buy those books and hand them out. And so that was it's kind of like a gift at the start of the year, and that we dip into it in meetings. The second time that I referred to that after the handing out, the gifting of those, there was those chuckles and those, we're going to do the culture code now, are we? And all of that. So that's one example of that code.
And it drains you. It makes you feel stupid. Yes. It embarrasses you. It shames you. And it is that passive aggressive laughing at you, rolling of the eye, knocking you on the shoulder. What are you like with these bloody newfangled ideas you're bringing in? Here we go again. And that, you're right, that is as soul destroying as being in an office being shouted at. It's not okay. And actually, where employment law is concerned, Sarah, it's illegal, isn't it?
It's tantamount to harassment.
Yeah.
It's tantamount to harassment. And it's the sort of thing that, interestingly, I think it's I'm going to say something really contentious, and I'm probably going to get shot down somewhere, ironically, on the place that I'm going to talk about. I think it's easier to prove this sort of thing on social media with screenshots of comments here and there than it is when it's in a work environment and it's happening through the body language, the gestures, the words that are said in the moment. The law is now that actually the police will act if it's in written form very quickly, but it's very difficult in a work environment face to face to prove that that's happening, and you talk yourself out of it. You said it yourself. Is it me?
Yeah.
I'm questioning, is it me?
When your wife went in and she went, oh my God, what you and the other coach did was justify, minimize, and just go, well, welcome to our world. Okay, that's it. You've normalized it. Now,
Yes.
that professional that you talked about who you held in high esteem, you had other people this was happening to. It's when you get a team of people who want to whistle blow. That's probably where the power could be. But they're all frightened and isolated. The woman you really respected, now leave me out of it, mate. I am getting on with what I'm getting on with. I'm not interested. And that's one of the real successes of bullying. It's to isolate people.
Yeah.
So you're out. You get out of, wow. You have your therapy. Do you relocate, Paul, to bring us to where you are today? Have you relocated? Have you gone back home? Where are we at? What did you do?
Yeah, so it's a good question because it definitely fast forwarded some plans. My wife and I had to come and live in the UK again. We were like, when it came to the point when I was like, no, I'm out, I'm resigning, I'm not even going to see the end of the year out, I can't go back, don't trust mediation, etc. So we were very lucky that we've got a house in Oxfordshire which we bought when I got that job in St. Clair's in Oxford, which I talked about, our second international job. And we've had amazing tenants, and luckily the way it worked with what their lives were doing, and we didn't feel like we were booting them out in the street. It sort of worked out with their next move. We were able to give some heads up. So we moved back here, and that's where, I mentioned at the start of the show that the NHS thing came up. I saw some possible work in the town that we were moving back to, with the NHS in the call centre, and thought, well, we don't really know what we're going to be doing yet, but this might be interesting to certainly pay the bills, keep the wolf from the door. And so I applied for the training of that and was successful. And the rest is history. It's been an absolutely superb organisation to work for. Talk about regrowing professional confidence. Just the overall, the way that the training took place, the way the trainees were welcomed, the way we were guided in terms of what the options were, what the work would be, what the challenges would be, etc., etc., etc. Really best practice of not just, education in terms of training, but how a highly functioning team should operate. And so as a result, I've stayed there, and now, as I mentioned at the top of the show, I'm doing some coaching there, I'm doing some team leadership there, and I'm really invested now in, hopefully bringing some transferable skills to that world. And my wife, by luck more than judgment as well, she applied for a few jobs in the same kind of way, just saying, well, we're back here, let's get some work. She got a different job with the NHS and doing some admin leadership around community hospitals, and has since got a promotion to head up a non-clinical admin team in an outpatient department, which is just opened up in the north of Oxfordshire. So again, transferable skills sounds like a cliche. You don't know until you do it. I'm sure you guys can appreciate this. But then you go, oh my goodness, people in their 30s are looking up to me, and I've only just started here, and they're asking me questions, and I'm able to provide advice without ego. Literally, I've got something to offer, and yeah, the confidence builds, and suddenly you're realizing, to quote you guys, that there is life after teaching. 100%.
Hello, loyal listeners. We're not going to go full on Bob Geldof during Live Aid, but if you could give us some of your money, even pennies, to help us fund the amazing Pit Pony podcast, the link is in the episode notes below. It's called Buy Us a Coffee, and we really do appreciate your contributions. Thank you. We always come to this. When we get to this section in the podcast, that's when people blossom and bloom, that body language changes, that semantic field shifts, because you've remained the same, but it's the environment that changes. It is the environment that brings out the very best in the individual, the culture, the structure that needs to succeed, and allowing the people around you to be the very, very best versions of themselves. So with that in mind, what's your sliding doors moment then? What are you going to bring to us that has happened, Paul, since you relocated but left teaching? Tell us a moment in your life that you know wouldn't have happened had you have remained where you were.
Again, really, really tough question, really good question. And, I'll probably give you 100 answers. I think, the first response is, honestly, and I hope it doesn't sound cliched again, the gift of time. I think we're sort of blinded sometimes in teaching that one of the big perks is 13 weeks a year holiday, which is a big perk. But we sort of seem to think that there isn't time then in other professions. And I've definitely had the gift of time. And I think, therefore, the biggest sliding doors moment was having a time for long-term friends that maybe we hadn't seen and spent time with over, the 25, 30 years overseas. And the most important one at the moment is a very, very close friend who, interestingly, is also an ex-teacher, an ex-international teacher. And he currently lives down in St Agnes in Cornwall, and his life took a different turn to mine, and he was faced with a life-changing cancer about 4 or 5 years ago. And long story short, he had to have a life-changing operation or face palliative care. And because of his family circumstances and his resilience and drive, he chose the life-changing operation, which is thankfully, and touch wood, has left him cancer-free, and it's also left him disabled. But the sliding doors moment was a day last summer, which wouldn't have happened if I'd still been overseas and still been teaching. It wasn't in summer holidays, to speak in school terms. And we went kayaking off the coast of St Agnes in Cornwall. He and I, his disability is there. It becomes a little bit less when you're in water, because obviously your legs matter less when you're floating in the water and so on. And we kayaked and we snorkeled. And yeah, he squealed with joy when we went through a couple of caves that he knew about. He's an ex-lifeboat guy as well, RNLI lifeboat volunteer. And to spend that day with Tom, you can hear the emotion. Sorry.
Please don't apologise.
So that wouldn't have happened without all of this. So, yeah. It was a very, very special day on the coast of Cornwall, and hopefully there'll be many more.
Well, I wish you many, many more, because to spend time with you, Paul, has been remarkable. It really, really has. You have spoke with such eloquence and compassion, and you've been incredibly measured. You've talked through very difficult times, and what we're realising more and more, myself and Sarah, is people are coming on talking about periods of their life that they'd healed from, or they put to one side, and they reliving it. And I should imagine, in between us speaking and you recording this today, you've had certain things come back to you and things have come back up. So thank you for coming and sharing that with us today. It isn't easy.
Yeah, not at all. And I really appreciate it, because I think what's also really important to say is, in regards to, to quote you, the healing process, there really isn't any bitterness anymore. And one of the things my therapist said was, it's okay to be angry. The emotion of anger isn't in itself negative. And sometimes we say that. She said, you know where to put your anger, and I quote her again, and she was speaking in her second language, which I always, hold my hands up to. She also said, righteous anger is okay sometimes.
100%. Oh, I like that. So I think we will leave with that beautiful thought. Righteous anger is okay sometimes. Paul, thank you for your time. It has been an absolute inspiration to sit and listen to you. And on behalf of myself, Sarah, and all of our listeners, thank you very much.
Thank you both as well.
Thanks, Paul.
Well, Sarah, what I loved about that, we started teaching at about the same time. I think he was the year below me at school. And I genuinely would like to think that had I have known him, he would have remained one of the good guys in my life. Somebody who would have been a great friend, very wise, probably somebody I would have turned to as a colleague and a friend throughout my life for advice. He was sage, he was measured. There's just something about him that you just felt you were in the presence of a genuinely good guy. And I always feel like this when we do an epilogue and we've listened to somebody's experience and then their thrival. What a loss to the profession. What an absolute loss to the profession. What a great leader and head teacher he would have been had that have been his path. And it saddened me in some ways to hear what he went through in those last 2 years, because I really felt a sense of injustice. The way he was spoken to, the way he was treated. And I think he fell victim of the narcissistic traits within teaching and within leadership positions.
I don't want to generalize that much. He fell victim to the narcissistic traits of those people that he was around, because I don't think it's not all leaders. It's not, but listening to him and listening to what he was describing and knowing some of the work that I've done and reading on that, he was subject to a very narcissistic leader. And there were two of them, and there were two camps. And he said very early on, one of the red flags that came up pretty quickly, pretty early, was that because he'd, I think, worked under the director in a different context, he was deemed to be one of his guys. There was a them and us straight away at the start, and that them and us was being driven by two very narcissistic people.
It was really difficult to listen to in parts, and it was really difficult to listen to the impact that it had had on him as a person. I mean, it's always great that he's out the other side and he's now thriving and he's in that world, but I've not heard that type of bullying, really. We deal with the more typical types of bullying, and it was a very, very difficult listen for me. It really was. It was a fascinating insight into teaching abroad, because up until that last school, Sarah, he loved it. When we were doing our pre-record, the stories he was telling me, the places he's seen, felt in relationship with his wife. They've got a shared vision over 25 years of marriage, no doubt, where they knew what they wanted for their kids, their lifestyle. I thought what he said about travelling and education being... it was brilliant. He'd had a clear vision of how he wanted to live his life. And he had a really difficult couple of years, but it's not defined him.
And also, it didn't define him at the time, because if you listened to what he talked about, he still managed to build teams with trust. He still managed to achieve what he wanted to achieve to an extent in terms of getting it right for kids. In spite of everything that was going on around him, he still was able to maintain his own path. And I think there was a moment, and obviously listeners can't see it, but there was a moment where I can't remember what question I asked him, but I think I talked about the covert nature of a lot of the bullying that goes on in schools that we talk to people about. I think he had a moment of kind of light bulb moment with that of, oh, actually, yeah, now you're saying that, there was stuff that went on.
Yeah.
So to be sat with covert stuff and the overt's actually easier to deal with in a lot of respects, because you can see it, you can deal with it, it's done. But yeah, it struck me that his clarity about what he wanted to achieve and who he was really, really shone through with that he still managed to build a team that were able to deliver despite the nonsense that was going on around him and towards him.
Like when he came in, it was to me, it was a couple of things, and I thought, yeah, he's right. He wanted croissants and coffee. He wanted to buy them all a book. This was about building people, valuing people, seeing people, developing them. To actually come in with a resource about culture, or I can't remember what the book was he said he gave.
The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle.
I mean, could he have dropped more of a ball where he's in a toxic culture and he's trying to detoxify that culture? It must have frightened them to death when he was doing that kind of stuff. And the greatest leaders that I've worked under have always done that. They've referenced other people's material. They've guided you in the right direction of self-development. Those who I've worked under who haven't done that, they know best. Yeah. They do it from them. They don't rely on other people and other experts, and they certainly don't want to educate the people around them. He felt trapped. He felt he was just stuck in this horrible, horrible world. And to think of him, because his world, he was going to be a professional footballer, really outdoors. The fact he was cycling to school. So I've got this image of him. He's cycling through the streets of Warsaw. He's on his bike, and he cannot a physically fit man cannot get into a building because he can't breathe. His body is breaking down. This is a man who probably does his macros and his nutrients and his steps in a day. He probably does 10,000 steps a day just thinking about what exercise he's going to be doing. And it physically impacted him to the point where he could not get on a bike and ride a bike. It was a heartbreaking one. It really was for me. And I think when he got upset telling his sliding door story, we spoke to him afterwards and he apologised and he said, I'm so sorry. And I said, and we immediately went, please don't. Because male voices who are talking about these experiences, who are showing their emotions, is what we need. We need to, if he's in a world where it's normalised that you shout and scream at people, then we want to be in a world where it's normal for men to talk about their feelings and show emotion and get upset. Because the more you surround yourself with that culture and that understanding, it will be the legacy of our pit pony, hopefully, that men start to benefit from what's going on. Because that happened, it was all male players, wasn't it, in his world? A toxic alpha male sandwich.
Yeah, and it was interesting, that was the language he used, didn't he, of two alphas. And I'm trying to think of my own circumstances over the years, and I cannot think of a situation where I've worked within teams where there's been two alpha males. There's always been, I mean, it is the term, isn't it? There's always been a beta to balance the alpha, and I can't imagine what that would be like, because I'm sure that would create in me a sense of how on earth do you make your voice heard, and I don't necessarily mean But how do you make yourself heard in a team where you've got two people who are displaying that kind of, because alpha behavior, and I know it's not just men, I know there's women as well. It's that arrogance and grandiosity of my way or the highway, and that doesn't get you anywhere. Ultimately, it might for a period of time, but it doesn't ultimately, because your team then stops speaking up, they stop offering opinions, they stop making suggestions, and your team ends up weaker and less enriched for it.
You always want, and you've talked about it in the past, you always want that kind of leader within a school or any environment that is going to publicly back you, but is not frightened of taking you in a room and privately going, what the actual? That's okay. It is okay. And strong leadership is making you feel, I've totally got your back here, but I am also confident enough to challenge you when things are not going the way it should be going. But it's like you said, I cannot imagine how that must have been. People had different coping mechanisms within that school. Yeah. A woman he went to, who he massively respected, just went, count me out. I have built a world for myself here where I know what I'm doing. I'm totally safe. It's not ideal. It's not where I want to be, but I am coping. And it was a very, very sad episode for me, that it really did, just because of who he was as a person more than anything. Such a genuinely decent person who now is, as they always do, thriving in the right environment, able to bring his skill set, and another organisation, the NHS, is benefiting from those leadership skills. So I thought it was another. There's similar episodes there, but they're all unique in their own ways, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. Can I lighten the mood, though?
Oh, yes, please. Go on.
At the start, when you said about going to Warsaw, I misheard you, and I thought you said Walsall, as in the West Midlands. And I was trying to think, how is that an international school? I genuinely sat there for the first 5 minutes going, I don't know where this is going.
Oh, no. And of course, he's naming all these places to me that he's been to, and I haven't got a clue. You know, I can't even tell you geographically where the Cotswolds is in England, let alone where half of these places were. But a fascinating guy with a fascinating life and a fascinating story as well. So it's one I think I would listen to a couple of times to really start to pick out and educate myself on some of the things that went on there. So, cracking episode again. We tend to record these on a Sunday afternoon. So as it gets to the end of the epilogue, I always start thinking all things Sunday dinner. What are you having to eat?
One of the HelloFresh recipes. I don't know which one yet.
Oh.
Probably some really big stacked burger, possibly.
I'm just doing a simple big chicken.
Nice.
And controversially, Aunt Bessie's roast Yorkshire puddings. We do Yorkshire puddings with every single roast. My mum, I can hear her in the back, they should only be served with beef, but we will bang some Aunt Bessie's on, irrespective of the meat. Okay.
Listen.
Go on.
To me, a roast dinner is about the trimmings, and this is going to go down a rabbit hole. I have no issue with there being pigs in blankets, stuffing, Yorkshire pudding, the mustard, and the mint sauce if necessary. Bring it.
Oh,
bring it all.
Am I right in thinking you put something on Facebook the other night about a Yorkshire pudding stuffed with...
Yes, with clotted cream and jam. And somebody said that that Yorkshire pudding with jam is actually quite an old thing. I've yet to go down that rabbit hole, but yes. Anyway, listeners.
Yeah, healthy. Rambling Dunwood. Right, okay, fantastic. And let's bring this to a close, my friend, and I'll see you on the other side.
Ta-ra.
Thank you so much for staying with us throughout another great episode. And on behalf of myself, Sarah Dunwood, and all at the production team, we appreciate your continued support. If you wish to contact me directly for a support session or a clarity call for your next steps, please find my link in the comments below. See you soon.